The classified ad in the Cedar Falls Gazette was desperate enough to make Elena Moreau pause over her morning coffee. Seeking experienced ranch hand. Must be exceptional with difficult horses. Previous applicants have quit within days. Serious inquiries only. Willowbrook Ranch. What the ad didn't mention was that Jake Harrison had already fired 12 men in 6 months, each one walking away from his ranch with stories about the black stallion that seemed determined to destroy everything in its path. Elena clutched the newspaper tighter, knowing she had exactly 3 days before the bank would foreclose on her small cabin. She had never worked with horses professionally, but desperation has a way of making impossible choices seem reasonable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Ranch. When Elena Moreau stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her worn carpet bag clutched in one hand, and her 6-year-old son Tommy's small fingers gripped tightly in the other. The ranch stretched before them like something from a dream she'd forgotten she was allowed to have. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle and horses, all framed by the majestic Rocky Ridge Mountains that seemed to touch the endless Wyoming sky. But dreams, she'd learned the hard way, often came with a price she couldn't afford to pay. Jake Harrison stood on the porch of the main house, his weathered hands resting on the railing as he watched the woman and child approach. He'd been expecting another grizzled cowboy with calloused hands and tobacco-stained teeth, someone who could handle the fury that was midnight, the stallion that had become his personal nightmare. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman whose dark hair was pinned back severely, whose simple gray dress spoke of careful mending and stretched budgets, but whose shoulders were set with the kind of determination that came from surviving the kind of losses that broke lesser people. The letter she'd sent in response to his advertisement had been brief and professional, mentioning experience with livestock and a need for immediate employment. What it hadn't mentioned was the quiet desperation that seemed to emanate from her, like heat from sun-baked earth, or the way her green eyes held shadows that spoke of grief still fresh enough to draw blood. Jake found himself reconsidering the wisdom of hiring someone sight unseen, especially when that someone came with a child in tow and looked like a strong wind might blow her clean off his property. Tommy pressed closer to his mother's side as they approached the house, his wide blue eyes taking in everything from the chickens pecking in the yard to the massive barn that seemed to loom against the sky like a cathedral made of wood and dreams. He'd never seen so much open space, had never heard silence that wasn't filled with the sounds of city life pressing in from all sides. The boy's presence complicated everything about Jake's carefully laid plans, but the woman's letter had been clear about her circumstances, and he'd agreed to the arrangement sight unseen because good help was harder to find than water in a drought. Elena's first glimpse of her potential employer told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man who would place such a desperate advertisement in a newspaper. Jake Harrison was younger than she'd expected, probably no more than 35, with the kind of face that had been carved by weather and worry in equal measure. His hands, she noticed, bore the scars of someone who worked with animals that didn't always appreciate his efforts, and there was something in his dark eyes that spoke of recent defeats that had cost him more than just money. This was a man, hanging on to something by his fingernails, and she recognized the look because she'd been wearing it herself for the better part of a year. The ranch house itself was solid and well-maintained, but she could see the signs of a place that had known better days. Paint peeling slightly around the window frames, a porch step that sagged just enough to suggest repairs that had been postponed, gardens that had been started with good intentions but had succumbed to the demands of more pressing concerns. It was the kind of place that had been built by people who believed in the future, and she found herself hoping that some of that optimism might still be hiding somewhere in its weathered walls. Jake's sister Victoria emerged from the house just as Elena and Tommy reached the bottom step of the porch, and the family resemblance was immediately apparent in the stubborn set of her jaw and the way she carried herself like someone who had never met a problem she couldn't solve through sheer force of will. Victoria's dress was newer and finer than Elena's, her hair styled in the latest fashion, and her expression held the kind of polite skepticism that wealthy women reserved for situations that didn't meet their carefully maintained standards. The silence stretched between them like a rope under tension as Jake struggled to reconcile the reality of Elena Moreau with whatever expectations he'd built from her letter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was younger than he'd imagined, probably no more than 28 or 30, and there was something about the way she held herself that spoke of education and refinement that seemed at odds with her obvious financial circumstances. Her hands, he noticed, were soft enough to suggest she hadn't spent her life doing manual labor, but there was something in her eyes that told him she was prepared to learn whatever this job required. Tommy's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and Elena's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she realized they'd been traveling since before dawn with nothing more than the heel of yesterday's bread between them. She'd spent their last dollar on the stagecoach fare, gambling everything on the hope that this job would provide not just employment, but the kind of fresh start that seemed impossible to find in the city where everyone knew her business and pitted her circumstances. Victoria's expression softened slightly at the sight of the hungry child, her maternal instincts overriding her reservations about this unexpected turn of events. She stepped forward with the kind of gracious efficiency that came from years of managing a household, gesturing toward the door with an invitation for coffee and whatever else the kitchen might provide. Her words were carefully polite, but Elena caught the underlying tension that spoke of a woman who was not entirely pleased with her brother's hiring decisions. Jake found his voice as they climbed the porch steps, explaining that the position would include room and board for both Elena and Tommy, along with wages that would be paid weekly rather than monthly. The relief that washed over Elena's face at this news told him more about her circumstances than any letter could have conveyed, and he felt a twist of something that might have been protectiveness settling in his chest like smoke from a fire he hadn't meant to light. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of morning light that promised good things were possible, and Tommy's eyes widened at the sight of Victoria buttering thick slices of bread while coffee percolated. On the stove, Elena accepted the offered cup with hands that trembled slightly, whether from exhaustion or emotion Jake couldn't tell, but he found himself studying the way she held herself even in this moment of obvious vulnerability, as if she were determined not to let circumstances diminish whatever dignity she had left. The conversation that followed was careful and professional, covering the basic requirements of the position and the expectations Jake had for someone working with his livestock. Elena listened intently, asking questions that demonstrated both intelligence and a genuine desire to understand what would be required of her. She mentioned experience helping her late husband with his small farm, carefully omitting the fact that their livestock had consisted of 3 chickens and a goat that had died the winter before her husband's accident. It was Tommy who inadvertently revealed the depth of their desperation when he asked, with the innocent directness of childhood, whether they would really have their own room and whether there would be enough food every day. The question hung in the air like smoke, and Elena's face flushed with the particular shame that comes from having your private struggles exposed to strangers who might judge you for circumstances beyond your control. Jake's response was immediate and decisive, assuring both mother and son that Willowbrook Ranch had plenty of room and that Victoria's cooking was legendary throughout Cedar Falls. His words carried the weight of a promise, and Elena felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for months finally begin to loosen. This might not be the life she'd planned, but it was a chance at survival, and sometimes survival was the first step towards something that might eventually resemble hope. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions to the ranch, hands, and a tour of the facilities that would become Elena's new world. The barn was massive and well-organized, filled with the sounds and smells of horses and hay and leather that spoke of a working ranch in its prime. The bunkhouse where she and Tommy would stay was simple but clean, with windows that looked out over pastures that seemed to stretch all the way to the mountains. But it was when Jake led her to the far paddock that Elena got her first glimpse of the real challenge that awaited her. Midnight stood alone in the enclosure, a magnificent black stallion whose coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the morning sun. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way he held his head high and alert, as if expecting danger from every direction. This was not just an unbroken horse, she realized, but an animal that had learned to associate human contact with pain or fear or loss. Jake's voice carried a mixture of frustration and admiration as he explained Midnight's history, how the stallion had been the pride of the ranch until something had happened to change his nature completely. 3 months ago, he'd been gentle enough for children to ride, but now he was a terror that had injured two experienced hands and destroyed thousands of dollars worth of equipment. The veterinarian had suggested putting the animal down, but Jake couldn't bring himself to destroy something that had once been so magnificent. Elena found herself studying Midnight with the kind of focus she'd once reserved for her late husband's moods when the pain from his war injuries had made him unpredictable and dangerous. There was something in the stallion's eyes that reminded her of David during his worst moments, a kind of wild desperation that came from being trapped in circumstances that felt beyond control. She didn't realize she'd spoken aloud until Jake turned to her with surprise, asking her to repeat what she'd said about trauma-changing behavior patterns. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows when Elena finally found herself alone with her thoughts, sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse while Tommy explored the immediate area under Lucas's watchful eye. The ranch hand had taken to the boy immediately, showing him how to gather eggs and promising to teach him to ride once they got settled. Elena watched her son laugh at something Lucas said, and realized it had been months since she'd heard that sound, months since Tommy had been around men who treated him with kindness rather than pity. Victoria's voice carried across the yard as she called them in for supper, and Elena felt that strange sensation again, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where they could build something new from the wreckage of everything they'd lost. The feeling was fragile and tentative, like a wild bird that might take flight at the first sudden movement. But it was there nonetheless, settling into her heart like warmth from a fire she'd thought had gone out forever. The evening meal was simple but abundant, and Elena found herself relaxing slightly as the conversation flowed around the table. Jake spoke about his plans for expanding the ranch's breeding program, contingent on solving the problem with Midnight, while Victoria shared news from town and Tommy listened with the wide-eyed fascination of a child discovering a completely new world. It was the kind of family dinner Elena had imagined having when she'd first married David, before the war had taken something essential from him and left her with a stranger who flinched at sudden sounds and woke screaming from dreams he couldn't describe. As the sun set behind the Rocky Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed too beautiful for the harsh realities of frontier life, Elena found herself standing on the porch with Jake, both of them looking out over the ranch that might become her salvation or her next failure. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the sounds of evening settling over the land like a blanket pulled up against the approaching night. Jake's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, telling her that he'd noticed how she'd looked at Midnight, as if she saw something in the stallion that others had missed. Elena considered her response carefully, knowing that honesty might cost her this job, but that deception would only delay the inevitable reckoning. She told him about David, about the way war had changed him, about learning to read the signs of approaching storms in the set of someone's shoulders or the tension around their eyes. The conversation that followed revealed more than either of them had intended to share with a virtual stranger, but sometimes desperation creates its own intimacy, binding people together through shared understanding of what it means to lose everything and still have to find a way to keep breathing. Jake spoke about his father's death 6 months earlier, about inheriting a ranch that was mortgaged to the hilt and a responsibility that felt heavier than the mountains themselves. Elena talked about the accident that had taken David, about the debts that had consumed everything they'd built together, about the fear that had driven her to answer an advertisement for a job she wasn't qualified to perform. By the time they said goodnight and retreated to their respective quarters, both Elena and Jake understood that this arrangement was about more than just employment. It was about two people who had been knocked down by life finding a way to help each other stand back up, about creating something stable and good from the rubble of dreams that hadn't survived contact with reality. Neither of them spoke of love or romance or anything beyond the immediate needs that had brought them together, but there was something in the air between them that suggested possibilities neither had dared to consider. Elena lay awake in the narrow bunk that night, listening to Tommy's steady breathing and the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep around them. Through the small window, she could see stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet, more stars than she'd ever seen from their cramped apartment in the city. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the beginning of work that might prove beyond her capabilities. But tonight, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Moreau felt hope. Part 2. The unexpected arrival. Dawn broke over Willowbrook Ranch with the kind of golden light that made promises about the day ahead, but Elena's first morning as a ranch employee began with the harsh reality of just how unprepared she was for the work that lay before her. She'd risen before sunrise, as had been her habit since David's death, but the sounds that greeted her were entirely foreign to her city-trained ears. The lowing of cattle in distant pastures, the nickering of horses in the barn, the creak of windmill blades turning in the early morning breeze, all combined to create a symphony that spoke of a world she was only beginning to understand. Tommy had slept more soundly than he had in months, exhausted by the previous day's travel and excitement, and Elena found herself reluctant to wake him as she dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. The simple work clothes Victoria had provided the night before fit reasonably well, though the boots were slightly too large and would require extra socks to prevent blisters. She'd never owned clothing designed for manual labor, had never needed to consider the practical requirements of spending long hours outdoors in all weather, and the unfamiliarity of the garments served as another reminder of how far she'd traveled. From her previous life, the kitchen was already warm and filled with the aroma of coffee and bacon when Elena made her way to the main house, following the path Jake had shown her the evening before. Victoria was moving with practiced efficiency between stove and counter, preparing what appeared to be enough food to feed a small army, and she looked up with a smile that seemed more genuine than polite as Elena appeared in the doorway. The older woman's assessment was quick but thorough, taking in Elena's obvious nervousness and the way she held herself like someone preparing to be found wanting. Jake's entrance into the kitchen brought with it the scent of horses and hay and the particular smell of morning air that clung to people who worked outdoors before the sun rose. He moved with the easy confidence of someone entirely comfortable in his environment, pouring coffee with one hand while reaching for his hat with the other, and Elena found herself studying the way he inhabited his space with such natural authority. His greeting was warm but professional, inquiring about her night's sleep and Tommy's adjustment to their new surroundings with the courtesy of an employer who genuinely cared about his workers' welfare. The breakfast conversation revealed layers of complexity in the ranch's operations that Elena hadn't considered during her initial interview. Jake spoke of cattle drives and breeding schedules, of feed costs and market prices, of the delicate balance required to keep a working ranch profitable in an increasingly challenging economic climate. Victoria contributed updates about supply orders and correspondence from buyers, demonstrating a level of business acumen that surprised Elena and made her realize that running a ranch required skills far beyond simply caring for animals. Lucas joined them as they were finishing their meal, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that suggested he'd already formed favorable opinions about the ranch's newest employees. He spoke enthusiastically about Tommy's natural curiosity and eagerness to learn, describing how the boy had peppered him with questions about everything from chicken behavior to the proper way to approach a horse. Elena felt a warm flush of pride at hearing her son described in such positive terms, remembering how the teachers at his previous school had spoken of him as withdrawn and difficult, a child marked by circumstances beyond his control. The tour of the ranch's daily operations began in the main barn, where Elena was introduced to the complex choreography required to maintain 30 horses in peak condition. Each animal had its own personality and requirements, from the gentle mares used for ranch work to the spirited colts being trained for sale to distant buyers. Jake moved among them with the fluid grace of someone who had been working with horses since childhood, reading their moods and responding to their needs with an intuitive understanding that Elena both admired and despaired of ever matching. Her first assigned task was simple enough, mucking out stalls under Lucas's patient supervision while Jake attended to more complex matters involving a mare that was showing signs of impending labor. Elena had never realized how physically demanding such seemingly straightforward work could be how the repetitive motion of lifting and carrying would strain muscles she'd forgotten she possessed. The horses watched her efforts with varying degrees of interest and suspicion, some nickering softly when she passed while others turned away with the disdain of creatures unimpressed by amateur efforts. Tommy had been assigned to Victoria for the morning, learning the intricacies of chicken care and garden maintenance, and his delighted laughter carried across the yard as he discovered the particular joy of collecting warm eggs from nests still occupied by indignant hens. Elena paused in her work to watch him chase a particularly stubborn rooster around the coop, his face bright with the kind of unguarded happiness she'd feared might be lost forever in the aftermath of his father's death. The sun climbed higher as the morning progressed, and Elena began to understand why ranch work required rising before dawn. The physical demands of the job became exponentially more challenging as the temperature rose, and she found herself grateful for the shade provided by the barn's substantial structure. Her hands, soft from months of indoor work, began to blister despite the gloves Lucas had provided, and she realized that the calluses she would need to develop would take weeks of consistent effort to form properly. Jake's periodic check-ins on her progress were encouraging rather than critical, offering suggestions for more efficient techniques and praising her willingness to tackle unfamiliar work without complaint. She began to understand that his hiring decision had been based as much on character assessment as on stated qualifications, that he valued determination and reliability over experience that could be taught through patient instruction. The realization was both comforting and daunting, suggesting that success in this position would depend entirely on her ability to learn quickly and adapt to demands she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The mare's labor progressed throughout the morning, requiring Jake's constant attention and expertise as he monitored signs that would indicate whether human intervention might become necessary. Elena found herself drawn to observe the process whenever her own tasks allowed, fascinated by the ancient drama unfolding in the specially prepared birthing stall. Victoria joined them during the crucial moments, her presence adding an air of ceremony to what was obviously a significant event in the ranch's yearly cycle. The foal's arrival coincided with the noon meal, a gangly black colt that struggled to his feet with the determination of new life meeting the world for the first time. Elena watched in wonder as the mother immediately began the grooming process that would establish their bond, her maternal instincts overriding any exhaustion from the birthing process. Jake's satisfaction was evident in his relaxed posture and the way he spoke to both mare and foal with the gentle pride of someone who had successfully guided another life safely into existence. Lunch was eaten in companionable exhaustion, with Tommy regaling them with detailed accounts of his morning adventures, while Elena flexed fingers that were already showing signs of the work they'd performed. Victoria's meal was hearty and substantial, designed to fuel bodies that would spend the afternoon engaged in physical labor under increasingly challenging conditions. The conversation touched on plans for the afternoon and the gradual process of introducing Elena to more complex aspects of horse care as her basic skills developed. The afternoon brought Elena's first real encounter with midnight, though from the safety of the paddock fence rather than direct contact. Jake led her to the far enclosure where the stallion stood alone, his magnificent black coat gleaming in the sunlight, but his posture radiating the kind of tension that spoke of barely contained violence. Even at a distance, Elena could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, but it was intelligence coupled with suspicion and anger that made approaching him seem like an exercise in deliberate self-harm. Jake's voice carried a mixture of frustration and genuine affection as he recounted Midnight's history, describing the transformation from gentle companion to dangerous adversary that had occurred seemingly overnight 3 months earlier. The stallion had been his father's particular favorite, a horse whose bloodlines represented decades of careful breeding decisions and whose temperament had made him valuable not just for reproduction but for the kind of advanced training that commanded premium prices from discriminating buyers. The change had been sudden and complete, Jake explained, as if something fundamental in Midnight's nature had been broken beyond repair. Veterinary examination had revealed no physical injuries that might explain the behavioral transformation, no obvious signs of illness or neurological damage that could account for the stallion's violent unpredictability. The horse simply seemed to have decided that humans represented threats to be repelled with whatever force necessary, and no amount of patience or expertise had been able to penetrate the wall of hostility he'd constructed around himself. Elena found herself studying Midnight with the same focused attention she'd once applied to David's moods during his darkest periods, looking for patterns or triggers that might provide clues to understanding his condition. The stallion's movements were fluid and powerful, but there was something almost frantic about the way he paced the perimeter of his enclosure, as if he were searching for escape routes or threats that existed only in his own mind. His ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds that seemed to agitate rather than interest him, and his tail lashed with the kind of nervous energy that suggested internal pressures seeking release. The similarity to David's symptoms during his worst episodes was unmistakable, Elena realized, recognizing the hypervigilance and defensive aggression that had characterized her husband's struggle with memories that wouldn't stay buried. She'd learned to read the signs of approaching storms in David's behavior, to recognize when his mind was fighting battles that had ended years earlier but continued to rage in the darkness behind his eyes. Midnight's condition seemed to follow similar patterns, suggesting trauma that had created associations between human contact and danger that logic couldn't overcome. Jake's surprise was evident when Elena began asking specific questions about the timeline of Midnight's transformation, about environmental changes or unusual events that might have coincided with the behavioral shift. Her inquiries revealed a systematic approach to problem-solving that impressed him, a willingness to consider possibilities that veterinary science might have overlooked in favor of more conventional explanations. She suggested keeping detailed records of Midnight's behavior patterns, noting times of day when his agitation seemed most pronounced and environmental factors that might be contributing to his distress. The conversation that followed revealed Elena's growing understanding of the challenge she'd been hired to address, but also her recognition that conventional horse training methods would likely prove counterproductive when dealing with an animal whose problems stemmed from psychological rather than physical sources. She spoke hesitantly about techniques David's military doctors had attempted, about the slow process of rebuilding trust with someone whose mind had learned to interpret ordinary interactions as potential threats. Victoria's arrival at the paddock brought news that Frank Calloway had been asking questions in town about the ranch's new employee, specifically about Elena's qualifications and background. Calloway owned the neighboring spread and had been circling Willowbrook Ranch like a vulture for months, waiting for Jake's financial difficulties to reach the point where selling might become necessary. His interest in Elena's hiring suggested that he viewed any sign of instability or poor judgment as potential leverage in future negotiations. The implications of Calloway's curiosity cast a shadow over what had been an otherwise productive day, reminding Elena that her position at Willowbrook Ranch existed within a larger context of economic pressures and community politics that she was only beginning to understand. Jake's expression darkened at the mention of his neighbor's interference, and Elena sensed that the relationship between the two ranchers involved complications that went beyond simple business rivalry. The remainder of the afternoon was spent in more mundane tasks, cleaning equipment and organizing supplies, while Jake attended to correspondence that had arrived with the day's mail delivery. Elena found herself grateful for work that didn't require constant decision-making, allowing her mind to process everything she'd learned during her first full day at the ranch. The physical demands were significant but not overwhelming, and she began to believe that adaptation might be possible given sufficient time and determination. Tommy's excitement about his new environment continued unabated through the evening meal, with Victoria encouraging his enthusiastic questions about ranch operations and Lucas promising to begin his riding lessons within the week. Elena watched her son's animated conversation with a mixture of relief and wonder, remembering how withdrawn and fearful he'd become during the difficult months following David's death. The transformation was remarkable but fragile, dependent on circumstances that could change without warning if her employment proved unsuccessful. The evening found Elena once again standing on the porch with Jake, both of them looking out over pastures that were beginning to take on the quality of home rather than simply workplace. Their conversation touched on plans for Elena's continued training and the gradual process of introducing her to more complex aspects of horse care, but underneath the practical discussion lay currents of mutual assessment that had little to do with professional qualifications. Jake's admission that he'd been impressed by her observations about Midnight's condition came with the caveat that good intentions wouldn't be sufficient if she couldn't develop the practical skills necessary to implement whatever insights she might possess. Elena's response was honest about her limitations while expressing confidence in her ability to learn what the job required, given patience and proper instruction. The exchange felt like the beginning of a partnership based on mutual respect rather than simply economic necessity. The night sounds of the ranch were becoming familiar as Elena prepared for sleep, the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the stable eaves creating a soundtrack that was already beginning to feel like comfort rather than strangeness. Tommy had fallen asleep immediately, exhausted by a day filled with new experiences and physical activity that had stretched his city-trained endurance to its limits. Elena lay awake longer, processing the day's revelations and planning strategies for the challenges that tomorrow would certainly bring. Part 3. Recognition and Assessment. The second week at Willowbrook Ranch brought the kind of late spring weather that made Wyoming's reputation for harsh winters seem like malicious gossip, with warm days and cool nights that painted the landscape in shades of green that Elena had never imagined possible. Her hands were developing the calluses that Lucas had promised would come with time, and her body was adapting to the rhythm of physical labor that began before sunrise and continued until the last horse had been fed and settled for the night. More importantly, she was beginning to understand the complex personalities of the animals in her care, recognizing individual quirks and preferences that made each horse unique. Tommy had settled into ranch life with the adaptability of childhood, his initial excitement maturing into genuine competence as he learned to gather eggs without disturbing the hens and to move among the gentler horses without causing alarm. Victoria had become his willing accomplice in exploring every corner of the ranch, from the hayloft where barn cats raised their kittens to the creek that wound through the lower pastures where minnows darted between the rocks like living silver. His laughter had become a constant soundtrack to Elena's workdays, a reminder of what they'd gained by leaving their previous life behind. Elena's growing confidence with routine tasks had freed Jake to spend more time addressing the ranch's broader challenges, from negotiating with buyers who seemed increasingly reluctant to commit to purchases to managing the complex logistics of maintaining equipment and supplies in an environment where the nearest hardware store was a day's ride away. She'd begun to understand that ranching was as much about problem-solving and resource management as it was about animal husbandry, requiring skills that went far beyond the romantic notions she'd harbored about life in the countryside. The morning that changed everything began like any other, with Elena mucking out stalls while Jake examined a gelding that had developed a slight limp during the previous day's work. The routine was comforting in its predictability, providing structure to days that had once stretched endlessly before her with no clear purpose or direction. She'd found satisfaction in work that produced visible results, where effort translated directly into cleaner stalls and healthier animals and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that led to dreamless sleep. Frank Calloway's arrival shattered the morning's peace like a stone thrown through glass, his presence announced by the thunder of hooves and the jingling of spurs as he rode into the yard with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to having his presence acknowledged and his opinion solicited. Elena's first impression of Jake's neighbor was entirely unfavorable, from his calculating eyes to the way he surveyed the ranch's facilities with the appraising gaze of someone mentally cataloging assets that might soon be available for acquisition. Calloway's conversation with Jake was ostensibly friendly, inquiring about the new foal and commenting on the condition of the pastures after the recent rains, but Elena could hear undercurrents of threat and assessment in every exchange. The man's attention kept drifting to Elena herself, his gaze lingering in ways that made her skin crawl and reminded her unpleasantly of the creditors who had circled her previous home like wolves scenting weakness. His questions about her qualifications and experience were framed as neighborly interest, but the hostile gleam in his eyes suggested motivations that had nothing to do with courtesy. Jake's responses grew increasingly terse as Calloway's visit progressed, his body language shifting into the kind of defensive posture that Elena had learned to recognize in horses that were being pressured beyond their comfort zones. The tension between the two men was palpable, crackling with years of accumulated grievances and territorial disputes that extended far beyond the immediate business of ranching. Elena found herself edging closer to the barn door, positioning herself where she could retreat quickly if the confrontation escalated beyond verbal sparring. The discussion eventually turned to midnight, with Calloway expressing mock sympathy for Jake's ongoing struggles with the stallion, while simultaneously questioning the wisdom of keeping such a dangerous animal on a ranch where inexperienced workers might be injured. His concern was transparently false, designed to highlight Elena's lack of qualifications while planting seeds of doubt about Jake's judgment in hiring her. The implication that she represented a liability rather than an asset stung more than Elena had expected, touching on insecurities she thought she'd successfully buried. Calloway's suggestion that he might be willing to take Midnight off Jake's hands for a nominal fee that would help defray the costs of replacing him with a more manageable animal revealed the true purpose of his visit. Elena watched Jake's face darken with anger at the transparent attempt to acquire valuable bloodstock at a fraction of its worth, recognizing the predatory behavior of someone who viewed his neighbor's difficulties as opportunities for personal gain. The stallion was worth thousands of dollars if his behavioral problems could be resolved, making Calloway's offer insulting rather than generous. Elena's intervention in the conversation was unplanned and probably unwise, but something about Calloway's smug assumption that Midnight was beyond help triggered memories of similar pronouncements about David's condition. She found herself stepping forward before conscious thought could override instinct, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority as she contradicted Calloway's assessment of the stallion's prospects for recovery. Her words drew startled attention from both men, Jake's expression shifting from surprise to intense interest, while Calloway's features hardened with irritation at being challenged by someone he obviously considered irrelevant. The silence that followed Elena's statement stretched taut as a bowstring, filled with implications that none of them had anticipated when the conversation began. She'd revealed knowledge and confidence that went far beyond anything her employment application had suggested, demonstrating familiarity with behavioral modification techniques that most ranch hands wouldn't possess. Calloway's questions became sharper and more pointed, probing for weaknesses in her assertions while simultaneously attempting to undermine her credibility through references to her obvious inexperience with actual horse training. Elena's responses revealed depths of understanding that surprised even Jake, as she described behavioral patterns in language that borrowed from both veterinary science and human psychology, drawing parallels between Midnight's symptoms and conditions she'd observed in damaged soldiers returning from war. Her analysis was systematic and thorough, identifying specific triggers that might be contributing to the stallion's aggressive responses while proposing interventions that addressed psychological rather than physical causes of his distress. Calloway's departure was abrupt and ungracious, his parting comments carrying thinly veiled threats about the consequences of keeping dangerous animals on property that bordered his own ranch. His warnings about liability and community responsibility were delivered with the kind of false concern that fooled no one, revealing his frustration at having his schemes disrupted by someone he'd expected to dismiss without consideration. Elena watched him ride away with the uncomfortable certainty that she'd made an enemy whose resentment would find expression in future interference. Jake's reaction to the confrontation was complex, mixing gratitude for Elena's support with obvious surprise at the knowledge she displayed during her exchange with Calloway. His questions were gentle but persistent, probing for information about her background that might explain capabilities she'd never mentioned during their initial interviews. Elena found herself in the uncomfortable position of having revealed more than she'd intended while still maintaining the careful fiction that had gotten her hired in the first place. The conversation that followed was delicate, with Elena threading the needle between honesty and self-preservation as she explained her familiarity with trauma-related behavioral changes. She spoke carefully about David's struggles, about the months spent learning to recognize warning signs and de-escalation techniques, about the similarities she'd observed between human and animal responses to experiences that overwhelmed normal coping mechanisms. Her explanations were truthful but incomplete, revealing enough to justify her earlier statements while avoiding details that might raise uncomfortable questions about her actual qualifications. Jake's interest in her insights was genuine and intense, suggesting that her observations about Midnight had resonated with his own frustrations about conventional approaches to the stallion's problems. He described previous attempts to work with the horse, cataloging failures that had cost money and endangered lives while producing no improvement in Midnight's condition. The veterinarian's recommendations had been limited to medication or euthanasia, neither of which addressed what Elena suspected were the root causes of the behavioral changes.
The remainder of the morning was spent in detailed discussion of Midnight's history, with Jake providing information about the stallion's background that painted a picture of an animal whose life had been disrupted by events that might have created lasting psychological damage. Elena listened carefully, noting details that supported her theory about trauma-induced behavioral changes while formulating preliminary strategies for addressing problems that traditional horse training hadn't been able to solve. Victoria's reaction to news of Calloway's visit was predictably negative. Her concern focused primarily on the potential consequences of having antagonized someone whose influence in the community could affect the ranch's business relationships. Her questions about Elena's confrontation with their neighbor revealed anxieties about social standing and community acceptance that went beyond simple concerns about economic retaliation. Elena began to understand that her employment at Willowbrook Ranch existed within a complex web of relationships and expectations that extended far beyond the immediate business of horse training. The afternoon brought Elena's first opportunity to observe Midnight at close range, with Jake's permission to approach the paddock fence while maintaining safe distances from an animal whose unpredictability had already proven dangerous to experienced handlers. The stallion's response to her presence was immediate and intense, his attention focusing on her with laser-like concentration that suggested recognition of something different about this particular human observer. Elena's assessment of Midnight's condition was conducted with the systematic thoroughness that David's doctors had taught her to apply when evaluating psychological distress in humans, noting physical manifestations of anxiety and hypervigilance that spoke of internal pressures seeking release. The stallion's movements were fluid and powerful, but there was something almost manic about his constant motion, as if stillness might allow thoughts or memories to catch up with him that he couldn't bear to confront. The patterns Elena observed in Midnight's behavior were strikingly similar to symptoms she'd learned to recognize in David during his worst periods, suggesting that the parallels between human and animal trauma responses might be more significant than conventional wisdom acknowledged. The stallion's defensive aggression and hypersensitivity to environmental stimuli matched textbook descriptions of combat-related stress disorders, indicating that whatever had triggered his behavioral changes had created lasting alterations in his neurological responses to perceived threats. Jake's willingness to consider unconventional approaches to Midnight's rehabilitation was born of desperation rather than confidence, but Elena sensed genuine respect for her insights even as he struggled to reconcile her apparent expertise with her obvious inexperience in practical horse handling. His questions revealed a man caught between hope and skepticism, wanting to believe that solutions might exist while fearing another costly failure that he couldn't afford to absorb. The evening found Elena struggling with the implications of her growing involvement in Midnight's case, recognizing that success or failure in helping the stallion would determine not just her continued employment but the ranch's financial survival. Jake's faith in her abilities was both flattering and terrifying, placing responsibilities on her shoulders that she wasn't certain she could bear. The weight of expectations was familiar from her marriage to David, but the stakes seemed even higher now that Tommy's future depended on her ability to deliver results that might prove beyond her capabilities. Victoria's concerns about community reaction to Elena's confrontation with Calloway proved prophetic when word of the incident reached town within days. Spreading through Cedar Falls with the speed that only gossip could achieve in small communities where entertainment was scarce and everyone's business was considered fair game for public discussion. The story had grown in the telling, transforming Elena's brief intervention into a dramatic confrontation that painted her as either a heroic defender of her employer's interests or a presumptuous outsider who had overstepped appropriate boundaries. The reactions revealed fault lines in the community that Elena was only beginning to understand, with established families taking sides based on long-standing alliances and grievances that had little to do with the actual merits of the situation. Some saw her defense of Jake's position as admirable loyalty, while others interpreted it as evidence that she'd forgotten her place in the social hierarchy that governed relationships between employers and employees, men and women, established residents and newcomers seeking acceptance. Elena's first trip to town since arriving at the ranch provided uncomfortable confirmation that her confrontation with Calloway had indeed created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate incident, with conversations stopping when she entered the general store and resuming in whispers after she'd passed. The attention was unwelcome but not entirely unexpected, reminding her of similar experiences during the final months of her marriage when David's increasingly erratic behavior had made them objects of speculation and pity in their previous community. Mrs. Betty Walsh, the proprietor of the general store and unofficial chronicler of local news, greeted Elena with the kind of bright curiosity that suggested fishing expedition rather than genuine friendliness. Her questions about Elena's background and qualifications were delivered with sugar-sweet concern about whether she'd found the ranch work more challenging than expected, but the underlying skepticism was unmistakable. Elena's responses were carefully non-committal, providing enough information to satisfy basic curiosity while avoiding details that might fuel additional speculation. The conversation with Mrs. Walsh revealed the extent to which Elena's presence at Willowbrook Ranch had become a topic of community interest, with opinions ranging from sympathy for Jake's difficult circumstances to criticism of his judgment in hiring someone whose qualifications remained mysterious. The subtext was clear: Elena was being evaluated not just as an employee but as a potential disruption to social patterns that had remained stable for decades, and the verdict was far from unanimous in her favor. Part 4. The challenge defined. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that had begun like any other, with Elena moving through her established routine of feeding and grooming while Jake attended to correspondence that seemed to arrive with increasing frequency as word of Midnight's problems spread throughout the territory. She'd been at the ranch for 3 weeks, long enough to feel genuinely competent at basic tasks but still acutely aware of how much she didn't know about the complex business of maintaining a working ranch. The rhythm of daily chores had become comforting, providing structure and purpose that had been missing from her life since David's death. Victoria brought the letter to the barn where Elena was working, her expression mixing excitement with apprehension in ways that immediately suggested significant news. The envelope bore the return address of Hammond and Associates, a livestock brokerage firm based in Denver that specialized in connecting breeders with wealthy buyers seeking premium horses for private collections and breeding programs. Elena had heard Jake mention the company in passing, always with the kind of reverence reserved for organizations that could transform a struggling ranch's fortunes with a single large transaction. Jake's face went through several expressions as he read the letter's contents, progressing from initial interest to growing excitement before settling into the kind of focused intensity that Elena had learned to associate with important decisions requiring careful consideration. He read the letter twice before looking up, his eyes bright with possibilities that hadn't existed moments earlier but which now seemed to fill the air around them with electric potential. The opportunity outlined in the letter was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, offering exactly the kind of breakthrough that Willowbrook Ranch desperately needed while demanding capabilities that Elena wasn't certain she possessed. Hammond and Associates had received inquiries from a wealthy railroad baron seeking to establish a breeding program featuring horses with specific bloodlines and temperamental characteristics, with Midnight's lineage matching their clients' requirements perfectly. The potential sale price was staggering, enough to pay off the ranch's mortgages and provide capital for expansion that could transform the operation from survival-focused to genuinely prosperous. The challenge lay in the client's insistence on personally evaluating any horses before committing to purchase, requiring demonstration of not just Midnight's bloodlines but his trainability and temperament under saddle. The evaluation was scheduled for 6 weeks hence, with Hammond's representative accompanying the potential buyer to assess whether Midnight met the exacting standards required for a breeding program that would produce horses worth thousands of dollars each. Failure to demonstrate the stallion's value would mean losing an opportunity that might never arise again. Elena's stomach clenched with anxiety as the implications became clear, recognizing that her confident assertions about Midnight's potential for rehabilitation had now become commitments that would be tested under the most demanding circumstances possible. The timeline was brutally short, allowing barely enough time to establish basic trust with a horse whose previous interactions with humans had been characterized by violence and mutual frustration. 6 weeks to transform a dangerous animal into a cooperative partner seemed impossible even under ideal circumstances. Jake's faith in her abilities was both touching and terrifying, his assumption that she could deliver on her earlier promises revealing the depth of his desperation beneath his outward confidence. He spoke of the opportunity as if success were inevitable rather than
unlikely, discussing plans for preparing midnight and coordinating with Hammond's representatives, as if the only question were logistics rather than fundamental feasibility. Elena found herself nodding agreement while her mind raced through everything that could go wrong with such an ambitious undertaking. The conversation that followed revealed layers of complexity that Elena hadn't fully appreciated during her earlier theoretical discussions about Midnight's rehabilitation. Jake explained the specific requirements that Hammond's client had outlined, including expectations for under-saddle performance that would test not just the stallion's willingness to accept human contact but his ability to respond to subtle commands and maintain composure under pressure. The evaluation would be conducted in public, with local ranchers and potential future clients observing demonstrations that could make or break the ranch's reputation. Victoria's reaction to the news was characteristically practical, immediately beginning to plan for accommodating distinguished visitors while calculating the costs of preparation and the risks of failure. Her questions revealed concerns about community reaction if the demonstration proved unsuccessful, particularly given Frank Calloway's obvious interest in any evidence of poor judgment that might support his territorial ambitions. The social implications of a public failure would extend far beyond financial consequences, potentially affecting the ranch's standing in a community where reputation was often more valuable than money. Elena's request for detailed information about Midnight's background revealed gaps in knowledge that had previously seemed unimportant but which now took on critical significance. Jake could describe the stallion's bloodlines and training history before his behavioral transformation, but the specific events that had triggered the change remained mysterious. Without understanding what had caused Midnight's current condition, developing effective interventions would require educated guesswork rather than systematic treatment of identified problems. The afternoon was spent in intensive discussion of strategies and timelines, with Elena outlining preliminary approaches based on her observations of Midnight's behavior patterns, while Jake provided practical information about equipment and facilities that would be required for serious training efforts. The conversation revealed the extent to which both of them were venturing into uncharted territory, combining Elena's theoretical understanding of trauma-related behavioral changes with Jake's practical experience in horse training to create hybrid approaches that neither had attempted before. Lucas joined their planning session as word of the opportunity spread throughout the ranch, his enthusiasm tempered by realistic assessment of the challenges they would face in attempting to rehabilitate a horse whose problems had defeated previous efforts by experienced professionals. His suggestions were practical and valuable, addressing safety concerns and equipment modifications that would be necessary for working with an animal whose unpredictability remained the defining characteristic of every interaction. The evening brought a celebration dinner that felt premature to Elena, given that they'd committed to achieving something that might prove impossible within an impossibly short time frame. Victoria had prepared a feast worthy of the occasion, but Elena found herself unable to fully enjoy the festivities while her mind continued to race through potential obstacles and contingency plans. Tommy's excitement about the prospect of watching her work with the famous stallion added another layer of pressure, as failure would disappoint not just employers but the son whose faith in her abilities had become one of her primary motivations. The conversation around the dinner table revealed how significantly the opportunity would affect everyone at Willowbrook Ranch, from the financial security it would provide to the professional recognition that could attract future clients and transform the operation from struggling family business to regional destination for serious horse breeding. Elena began to understand that her success or failure with Midnight would determine not just her own future but the dreams and aspirations of people who had welcomed her into their lives despite her obvious limitations. Jake's private conversation with Elena after dinner was both encouraging and sobering, acknowledging the magnitude of what they were attempting while expressing confidence in her abilities that she desperately wanted to deserve. His admission that the ranch's survival depended on success with Midnight added weight to responsibilities that already felt overwhelming.
but his willingness to entrust such critical tasks to someone with her limited experience spoke to desperation that had overcome normal caution about prudent business decisions. The details that emerged during their extended discussion painted a clearer picture of what success would require. From basic trust-building exercises that would allow safe human contact to advanced training that would demonstrate Midnight's potential value to sophisticated buyers whose standards were notoriously exacting. Elena found herself taking mental notes about techniques she'd need to research and equipment she'd need to master, recognizing that theoretical knowledge would prove worthless without practical skills that could only be developed through hands-on experience. The financial implications of the opportunity were staggering in both directions. With success promising to resolve the ranch's immediate problems while failure could accelerate the downward spiral that had begun with Jake's father's death. Elena learned for the first time about mortgages and debts that had accumulated during the transition period, about creditors who were growing impatient with delayed payments and neighbors like Calloway who were positioned to benefit from any forced sale of ranch assets. The timeline for preparation seemed to shrink with each passing hour as Elena began to comprehend everything that would need to be accomplished before Hammond's representatives arrived for their evaluation. 6 weeks had seemed reasonable when discussed in abstract terms, but the reality of transforming a dangerous animal into a cooperative partner required systematic progress through stages that couldn't be rushed without risking setbacks that might prove catastrophic to the entire enterprise. Elena's first night after accepting the challenge was spent in sleepless contemplation of everything that could go wrong. From physical injury that would end her involvement before it truly began to gradual recognition that her confidence had exceeded her capabilities by margins that couldn't be overcome through determination alone. The weight of expectations pressed down on her like a physical burden, reminding her uncomfortably of similar pressure she'd felt during David's worst periods when his recovery had seemed to depend entirely on her ability to provide support and understanding that she wasn't certain she possessed. The morning brought renewed determination along with stark recognition that theoretical preparation would need to give way immediately to practical application regardless of her lingering uncertainties about specific techniques and safety protocols. Midnight's rehabilitation couldn't wait for her confidence to catch up with her commitments, meaning that learning would have to occur simultaneously with implementation in ways that left no margin for significant errors. Jake's obvious faith in her abilities was both motivating and terrifying, serving as constant reminder that other people's dreams now depended on her capacity to deliver results that she'd promised based more on hope than proven expertise. The conversation about Midnight's training program revealed just how much she'd committed to accomplish, from basic behavioral modification to advanced performance demonstrations that would showcase the stallion's value to potential buyers whose expectations were formed by interactions with the finest. Part 5. Reading the Real Problem. The morning Elena first approached Midnight's paddock with serious intent rather than casual observation marked the beginning of what would either be her greatest triumph or her most spectacular failure. The early light cast long shadows across the enclosure where the stallion stood motionless, his black coat absorbing the sunrise like polished obsidian, while his eyes tracked her movement with the hyper-vigilant intensity of a predator assessing potential threats. She carried no equipment beyond a simple wooden stool and her grandfather's old journal, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of handling and filled with observations about animal behavior that she'd never imagined would prove relevant to her survival. Jake had given her complete autonomy in developing her approach to Midnight's rehabilitation, recognizing that conventional methods had failed spectacularly and that unconventional wisdom might be their only hope for success. His faith in her abilities was both humbling and terrifying, placing the ranch's future squarely on her shoulders while providing the freedom to experiment with techniques that more experienced trainers might dismiss as unorthodox or simply naive. Elena understood that this freedom came with corresponding responsibility, that failure would reflect not just on her judgment but on Jake's wisdom in trusting someone whose qualifications existed more in theory than proven practice. Victoria had insisted on safety protocols that Elena privately considered excessive but publicly accepted without argument. Understanding that her employer's sister had legitimate concerns about liability and community reaction if the ranch's newest employee was injured or killed during her first serious attempt to work with the notorious stallion. The agreed-upon procedures required Jake or Lucas to remain within shouting distance during any interaction with Midnight, with emergency plans in place for summoning medical assistance and protocols for documenting any incidents that might occur despite careful preparation. Elena's initial assessment of Midnight's condition was conducted from outside the paddock fence, with the stallion maintaining careful distance while she settled onto her stool and opened her grandfather's journal to pages that detailed behavioral patterns in traumatized horses. The parallels between animal and human responses to overwhelming experiences had fascinated her grandfather throughout his career as a veterinarian, leading him to develop treatment approaches that addressed psychological as well as physical aspects of animal health. His notes were written in the precise handwriting of a man who understood that observations might prove critical years after they were recorded. The stallion's response to her presence was immediate and intense, his attention focusing on her with the kind of concentrated interest that suggested recognition of something different about this particular human observer. Unlike previous handlers who had approached with equipment and intentions that Midnight had learned to associate with conflict, Elena simply sat quietly and watched, making no demands and issuing no challenges that might trigger defensive responses. Her stillness seemed to puzzle the horse, whose experience with humans had taught him to expect immediate attempts at dominance or control. Elena's grandfather had written extensively about the importance of reading an animal's emotional state before attempting any intervention, describing techniques for recognizing signs of fear, anger, confusion, or pain that might not be obvious to casual observers. Midnight's body language revealed layers of complexity that previous handlers had apparently missed, from the subtle tension in his neck muscles that suggested chronic stress to the way his ears swiveled constantly as if tracking threats that existed only in his memory. The stallion was not simply aggressive, Elena realized, but profoundly anxious, his violent responses serving as defense mechanisms against perceived dangers that rational assessment couldn't overcome. The patterns Elena observed in Midnight's behavior were strikingly similar to symptoms her grandfather had described in horses that had survived predator attacks or natural disasters. Animals whose psychological responses to trauma had created lasting changes in their neurological functioning. The hypervigilance and defensive aggression were textbook manifestations of what human doctors called combat fatigue, indicating that whatever had triggered Midnight's transformation had overwhelmed his normal coping mechanisms and left him trapped in a perpetual state of fight-or-flight activation. Jake's periodic check-ins during Elena's observation sessions revealed his growing appreciation for her systematic approach to understanding Midnight's condition, though she could sense his impatience with the slow pace of assessment when time pressures demanded immediate progress toward practical goals. His questions about timeline and methodology reflected legitimate concerns about balancing thoroughness with efficiency, recognizing that Hammond's representatives would arrive regardless of whether their preparation was complete. Elena found herself walking a tightrope between the comprehensive evaluation that Midnight's condition demanded and the urgent need to begin actual rehabilitation work. The breakthrough in understanding came during Elena's fourth day of observation, when a sudden thunderclap caused Midnight to exhibit responses that revealed the specific nature of his trauma with startling clarity. The stallion's reaction to the unexpected sound was immediate and extreme, his body language shifting from wary alertness to active panic as he began the kind of frantic pacing that suggested memory's overwhelming present reality. Elena watched in fascination and growing comprehension as Midnight's behavior followed patterns that her grandfather's notes had documented in horses that had experienced explosive violence. The realization that Midnight's problems likely stemmed from exposure to gunfire or similar explosive sounds opened new avenues for understanding his condition while simultaneously complicating the rehabilitation process in ways that Elena was only beginning to appreciate. If the stallion had indeed been traumatized by violent conflict, his recovery would require not just building trust with humans but specifically addressing learned associations between loud noises and mortal danger. The therapeutic implications were staggering, requiring techniques that went far beyond conventional horse training into territory that even her grandfather's extensive notes only touched upon. Elena's discussion with Jake about her preliminary findings revealed the complexity of what they were attempting. as she explained how Midnight's violent responses were not indications of inherent viciousness but rather symptoms of psychological injury that had altered his perception of environmental threats. The stallion's aggression was defensive rather than predatory, triggered by stimuli that reminded him of previous trauma rather than by any desire to harm humans for its own sake. Understanding this distinction was critical for developing effective interventions, but it also meant that conventional training methods based on dominance and submission would likely prove not just ineffective but actively counterproductive. The afternoon brought Elena's first attempt to enter Midnight's enclosure, an undertaking that required careful preparation and absolute attention to safety protocols that could mean the difference between progress and disaster. She moved slowly and deliberately, her grandfather's voice echoing in memory as she recalled his instructions about approaching traumatized animals without triggering defensive responses. Every gesture was calculated to communicate non-threatening intent, from the way she held her hands to the angle at which she positioned her body relative to the stallion's location. Midnight's initial response to her presence inside his territory was predictably intense, his body language shifting to high alert as he assessed this unprecedented breach of boundaries that had previously been respected by all human observers. Elena remained motionless near the gate, allowing the horse to process her presence without the additional pressure of movement or approach that might overwhelm his capacity for rational assessment. The minutes stretched like hours as they regarded each other across the space that separated prey animal from potential predator, each waiting for signals that would indicate the other's intentions. The stallion's gradual acceptance of her presence marked a significant milestone in their developing relationship. Though Elena understood that tolerance was far from trust and that any sudden movement or unexpected sound could instantly restore the distance that careful patience had temporarily bridged, she spent the remainder of the session simply sharing space with Midnight, allowing him to become accustomed to her scent and presence without any demands for interaction or cooperation. The work was slow and sometimes tedious, but Elena recognized it as essential foundation for any future progress. Victoria's concerns about the pace of Elena's work reflected broader anxieties about time pressures and community expectations that extended far beyond the immediate challenge of Midnight's rehabilitation. The ranch's reputation was riding on Elena's success, with neighbors and potential clients watching to see whether Jake's faith in an inexperienced outsider would prove justified or merely confirm suspicions about poor judgment that had led to the ranch's current difficulties. Elena felt the weight of these expectations like a physical burden, understanding that failure would affect not just her own future but the lives of people who had welcomed her despite her obvious limitations. Elena's evening conversations with Jake revealed his growing understanding of the complexity involved in Midnight's rehabilitation, as she explained how trauma-related behavioral changes differed fundamentally from simple training challenges that could be addressed through conventional methods. The stallion's problems required therapeutic intervention rather than educational correction, meaning that progress would necessarily be measured in weeks rather than days, and setbacks were not just possible but virtually inevitable. Jake's acceptance of these realities demonstrated remarkable faith in Elena's expertise, but she could sense his underlying anxiety about timelines that seemed increasingly optimistic given the magnitude of what they were attempting. The community's reaction to news of Elena's unconventional approach to Midnight's training was mixed, with some expressing admiration for her courage while others questioned the wisdom of allowing an inexperienced woman to work with an animal that had already proven dangerous to seasoned professionals. Mrs. Betty Walsh's comments at the general store reflected broader skepticism about methods that seemed to prioritize understanding over control, suggesting that Elena's techniques were too gentle for dealing with a horse whose problems required firm correction rather than psychological coddling. Frank Calloway's response to reports of Elena's progress was predictably negative, his public comments expressing concern for community safety while privately calculating how Elena's failure might advance his own interests in acquiring Willowbrook Ranch assets. His warnings about liability and responsibility were delivered with the kind of false concern that fooled no one, but they nonetheless planted seeds of doubt in minds that were already inclined toward skepticism about unconventional approaches to traditional problems. Elena's second week of working with Midnight brought incremental progress that felt simultaneously encouraging and frustratingly slow. As the stallion began to tolerate her presence for extended periods without exhibiting the extreme stress responses that had characterized their initial interactions, she'd established a routine of spending several hours daily in his enclosure, sometimes reading aloud from her grandfather's journal while the horse gradually became accustomed to the rhythm of human speech that carried no demands or threats. The work required patience that tested the limits of her endurance, but she recognized each small advancement as evidence that recovery was possible given sufficient time and consistency. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a session that had begun like many others, with Elena sitting quietly while Midnight maintained his customary distance and wary observation. A sudden commotion in the yard, involving loose chickens and shouting ranch hands, triggered the stallion's typical panic response, but this time, his flight pattern brought him directly toward Elena rather than away from her. Instead of the violent collision that everyone watching expected, Midnight stopped just short of trampling her, his eyes wide with terror but his body language showing recognition that this particular human represented safety rather than additional threat. The moment transformed their relationship in ways that Elena had hoped for but hadn't dared expect so soon, as Midnight's instinctive flight toward rather than away from her presence demonstrated trust that went beyond mere tolerance to actual reliance on her as a source of security. Elena remained perfectly still during the stallion's panic, allowing him to process the situation without additional pressure while Jake and Lucas watched from outside the fence with expressions that mixed relief and amazement at witnessing behavior that contradicted everything they thought they knew about Midnight's condition. The aftermath of the incident revealed changes in Midnight's behavior that extended beyond his relationship with Elena to encompass his general response to environmental stressors, suggesting that their work together was producing systemic improvements rather than simply situational tolerance for her specific presence. The stallion's recovery of emotional equilibrium after the chicken incident was noticeably faster than previous episodes, indicating that he was developing coping mechanisms that could help him manage future stressful situations without reverting to the extreme responses that had characterized his condition. Elena's documentation of Midnight's progress served dual purposes, providing both therapeutic records that would guide future interventions and evidence of improvement that might satisfy skeptics who questioned whether her methods were producing genuine results. Her grandfather's journal provided templates for recording behavioral observations in ways that captured subtle changes that might not be apparent to casual observers, allowing her to track progress that conventional assessment methods might overlook or dismiss as insignificant. The third week brought Elena's first attempt to establish physical contact with Midnight, an undertaking that required careful preparation and absolute attention to signals that would indicate the stallion's readiness for such intimate interaction. She began with the most non-threatening approach possible, offering her hand for inspection while remaining prepared to withdraw instantly if Midnight showed signs of distress or defensive activation. The horse's initial response was cautious but curious, his nostrils flaring as he processed her scent while his body language remained alert but not actively fearful. Midnight's acceptance of physical contact marked another milestone in their developing partnership, though Elena understood that trust was fragile and could be destroyed by any incident that reminded the stallion of previous traumatic experiences. She limited their physical interactions to brief moments of connection, gradually building positive associations with human touch while remaining sensitive to signs that Midnight's tolerance was reaching its limits. The work required intuitive understanding of equine psychology that went beyond anything she'd learned from books, demanding real-time assessment of emotional states that could shift without warning. Jake's observation of Elena's work with Midnight revealed techniques that challenged his assumptions about effective horse training, as he watched her achieve results through patience and understanding that conventional methods had failed to produce through force and dominance. Her approach seemed almost magical in its effectiveness, transforming a dangerous animal into a willing partner through methods that relied on psychological insight rather than physical control. The implications for the ranch's training programs extended far beyond Midnight's individual case, suggesting possibilities for working with difficult horses that could revolutionize their approach to breeding and sales. Victoria's evolving attitude toward Elena's work reflected broader changes in community perception as word spread about the remarkable progress being made with a horse that had been written off as irredeemably dangerous. The initial skepticism was giving way to grudging admiration, with neighbors who had questioned Elena's qualifications now expressing curiosity about techniques that seemed to produce results where traditional methods had failed. The shift in opinion was gradual but unmistakable, suggesting that success with Midnight could establish Elena's reputation as something more than simply Jake's desperate hiring mistake. The financial implications of Elena's progress with Midnight extended beyond the immediate opportunity with Hammond's representatives to encompass long-term possibilities for the ranch's breeding and training programs. Jake began to envision a future where their facility could attract clients seeking specialized help with problematic horses, establishing Willowbrook Ranch as a destination for therapeutic intervention rather than simply traditional training services. The potential for expanding their business model was exciting but also daunting, requiring investments in facilities and equipment that would commit them to approaches that were still largely experimental. Elena's growing confidence in her ability to help Midnight was tempered by awareness that their work together had only begun to address the underlying issues that had created his behavioral problems. The stallion's willingness to accept her presence and even limited physical contact was encouraging. But the real test would come when they began working toward the specific performance requirements that Hammond's representatives would evaluate. The transition from therapeutic relationship to training partnership would require navigating challenges that could easily trigger regression to previous patterns of fear and defensive aggression. The community's reaction to Elena's success with Midnight was complicated by Frank Calloway's continued efforts to undermine confidence in her methods and Jake's judgment in hiring her. His warnings about the dangers of working with traumatized animals carried enough truth to be persuasive, while his concerns about liability and community safety provided cover for territorial ambitions that had little to do with genuine worry about public welfare. Elena recognized that Calloway's opposition would intensify as her success became more apparent, making her achievements into threats that required active countermeasures. Elena's relationship with Jake had evolved during their work with Midnight,
developing from simple employer-employee interaction into genuine partnership based on shared commitment to the stallion's recovery and the ranch's survival. Their evening discussions about training strategies and behavioral observations had become opportunities for deeper connection, revealing compatibilities and mutual respect that went beyond professional collaboration. Elena found herself looking forward to these conversations with an intensity that surprised her, recognizing emotions that she'd thought were buried with David, but which seemed to be awakening in response to Jake's steady support and growing admiration for her abilities. The approaching deadline for Hammond's evaluation added urgency to work that Elena believed required more time for complete success, creating tension between therapeutic needs and practical demands that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. She faced the challenge of accelerating Midnight's rehabilitation without compromising the trust they'd built, knowing that any setback could prove catastrophic given the limited time remaining before their progress would be evaluated by experts whose standards were notoriously exacting. The pressure was unlike anything she'd experienced, combining professional demands with personal stakes that made failure almost unthinkable. Final part: the rancher and the widow. The morning of Hammond's arrival dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the pastures like scattered diamonds, and the Rocky Ridge Mountains standing sharp against a sky so blue it seemed painted by an optimistic artist who'd never heard of failure or disappointment. Elena stood at the kitchen window, her coffee growing cold in hands that trembled despite her efforts at appearing calm, watching the sunrise paint familiar landscapes with light that seemed to promise either triumph or disaster with equal indifference. In just 4 hours, everything she'd built at Willowbrook Ranch would be tested by men whose business required them to distinguish between genuine value and desperate pretense. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, carefully eating the breakfast Victoria had prepared, while stealing worried glances at his mother's rigid posture by the window. The boy had grown comfortable at the ranch over the past 6 weeks.
his initial excitement maturing into genuine attachment to the people and animals that had become his extended family. He understood that today's evaluation would determine whether they could stay in this place that had become home or would be forced to leave everything behind once again, though Elena had tried to shield him from the full weight of consequences that failure would bring. Jake entered the kitchen with the controlled movements of a man who'd spent sleepless hours rehearsing every detail of the day ahead, his usual easy confidence replaced by the kind of focused intensity that Elena had learned to associate with critical moments that could transform lives in the space of heartbeats. His greeting was warm but brief, acknowledging the magnitude of what lay ahead while maintaining the optimistic facade that had carried them through weeks of preparation fraught with setbacks and small victories that never quite felt sufficient for the challenges they were attempting to meet. Victoria bustled around the kitchen with nervous energy that betrayed her own anxiety about the outcome of Elena's work with Midnight, her usual gracious efficiency heightened by awareness that distinguished visitors would be evaluating not just the stallion's progress but the ranch's overall operation and management. The breakfast she'd prepared was elaborate enough to satisfy the most demanding guests, but Elena found herself unable to eat more than a few bites, her stomach too knotted with anticipation to accept nourishment that her body desperately needed for the physical and emotional demands of the day ahead. The sound of approaching carriages announced Hammond's arrival with military precision, the thunder of hooves and jingle of harness, creating a soundtrack that seemed to echo the rapid beating of Elena's heart as she prepared to face evaluation by men whose opinions would determine not just her future but the survival of everything Jake had inherited from his father. Through the window, she could see a procession that spoke of wealth and authority, from the matched team of bay horses pulling Hammond's carriage to the obvious quality of equipment and clothing that marked these visitors as members of society's upper echelons. Mr. Jonathan Hammond descended from his carriage with the measured dignity of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected other people's livelihoods, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as someone who dealt in significant sums of money as casually as others discussed the weather. His companion, identified in correspondence as Mr. Theodore Blackwood, the railroad baron seeking to establish his breeding program, emerged with the bearing of someone whose vast wealth had purchased not just luxury but the expectation that his desires would be accommodated without question or delay. Elena's first impression of their evaluators was distinctly unfavorable, recognizing in their expressions the kind of casual superiority that came from lives spent purchasing whatever they desired without consideration for the human costs of their decisions. These were men who viewed horses as investments rather than living creatures, whose primary concern would be return on capital rather than the welfare of animals whose value existed primarily in terms of breeding potential and resale opportunities. Jake's introduction of Elena to the visitors was handled with diplomatic skill that concealed his own nervousness about how his unorthodox hiring decision would be received by men whose experience with horse training was limited to the most conventional and expensive approaches available. His presentation of her credentials emphasized her unique methods and remarkable results with Midnight, while carefully avoiding details about her background that might raise uncomfortable questions about her actual qualifications for the work she'd undertaken. Hammond's assessment of Elena was swift and obviously skeptical, his expression suggesting that he found the idea of a female trainer questionable at best and the notion of unconventional methods potentially dangerous to valuable animals whose loss would represent significant financial liability. His questions about her training philosophy and previous experience were probing but polite, clearly designed to identify weaknesses in her approach that might justify recommending against the purchase they'd traveled considerable distance to evaluate. Blackwood's interest in Elena's methods was more genuine but equally demanding, his questions revealing sophisticated understanding of horse breeding and training that made casual deception impossible and required honest explanations of techniques that might sound absurd to someone whose experience was limited to traditional approaches based on dominance and submission. Elena found herself walking a verbal tightrope between confidence and humility, presenting her methods as effective innovations rather than desperate experiments whose success remained uncertain. The preliminary tour of ranch facilities was conducted with formal courtesy that barely concealed the visitor's professional assessment of everything from barn construction to pasture management, with Hammond making notes that would clearly influence his final recommendations about the wisdom of conducting business with Willowbrook Ranch. Elena observed their evaluation process with growing appreciation for the complexity of what Jake faced in maintaining relationships with clients whose standards were shaped by exposure to the finest operations in the country. Frank Calloway's unexpected appearance during the tour added unwelcome complications to an already tense situation. His arrival timed perfectly to coincide with the most critical moments of the evaluation process. His ostensible purpose was neighborly courtesy, but Elena recognized his presence as deliberate sabotage designed to plant seeds of doubt about the ranch's management and her own qualifications for working with valuable animals. His comments about community concerns and recent incidents were delivered with false concern that barely masked his obvious satisfaction at disrupting proceedings. The conversation that followed Calloway's arrival revealed undercurrents of territorial rivalry and business competition that Elena was only beginning to understand, as Hammond's questions about local market conditions and ranch management philosophy became opportunities for Calloway to suggest that Willowbrook's recent difficulties reflected deeper problems with judgment and financial stability. Elena watched Jake's expression darken with controlled anger as his neighbor's interference threatened to undermine everything they'd worked to accomplish. Elena's intervention in the deteriorating situation was both necessary and risky, requiring her to confront Calloway's implications directly while maintaining the professional demeanor that Hammond and Blackwood expected from someone whose methods they were already inclined to question. Her defense of Jake's ranch management and her own training techniques was passionate but controlled, presenting evidence of success that couldn't be dismissed as wishful thinking or desperate self-promotion. The moment of truth arrived as they approached Midnight's paddock, where the stallion stood alert but calm, his magnificent black coat gleaming in the morning sun, while his eyes tracked their approach with the kind of focused attention that Elena had learned to recognize as curiosity rather than defensive preparation for conflict. The transformation from the violent, unpredictable animal that had terrorized previous handlers to this composed and responsive creature was so dramatic that even Hammond's skeptical expression showed grudging surprise at what appeared to be genuine rehabilitation. Elena's entry into the paddock was conducted with the casual confidence that 6 weeks of intensive work had earned, her movements flowing with natural grace as she approached Midnight without the protective equipment that previous handlers had required for simple proximity to the once dangerous stallion. The horse's immediate response to her presence was everything she'd hoped for and more. His body language shifting to relaxed attention as he moved toward her with the fluid stride of an animal completely at ease with human companionship. The demonstration that followed exceeded even Elena's most optimistic expectations, as Midnight responded to her gentle guidance with willingness and precision that showcased not just his magnificent conformation but the intelligence and trainability that made him valuable for serious breeding programs. Each movement flowed naturally from the last, creating a partnership that spoke of trust and mutual respect rather than domination and submission, demonstrating possibilities for human-animal collaboration that conventional training methods rarely achieved. Hammond's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine interest as he observed interactions that challenged his assumptions about effective horse training, watching Elena achieve results through methods that emphasized understanding over control and partnership over dominance. His questions became more technical and specific, probing for details about her approach that might be applicable to other difficult animals in his client's collections, suggesting that her techniques had commercial potential beyond the immediate question of Midnight's suitability for purchase. Blackwood's evaluation was even more thorough and demanding, his examination of Midnight's conformation and movement revealing expert knowledge that made Elena grateful for the weeks of preparation that had brought the stallion to peak physical condition. His assessment was conducted with the methodical precision of someone whose investments required certainty about quality and potential, but his growing enthusiasm was evident in questions that shifted from skeptical evaluation to serious consideration of acquisition terms and conditions. The riding demonstration represented the ultimate test of Elena's work with Midnight, requiring her to mount and control an animal whose previous interactions with humans under saddle had resulted in injuries and property damage that had convinced experts the stallion was beyond rehabilitation. Elena's approach to the mounting process was gradual and careful, each step designed to ensure Midnight's continued cooperation while demonstrating the level of trust they'd achieved through months of patient relationship building. Midnight's response to Elena's weight and guidance exceeded everyone's expectations. His movements flowing with the natural grace and power that had made him valuable before his behavioral problems had rendered him essentially worthless for practical purposes. The stallion's willingness to accept direction while maintaining his natural spirit created exactly the combination of trainability and fire that sophisticated buyers sought in animals destined for breeding programs that would influence entire bloodlines for generations to come. The crowd that had gathered to observe the demonstration included not just Hammond and Blackwood but most of the ranch's employees and several neighbors who had been drawn by curiosity about the outcome of Elena's unconventional training methods. Elena found herself performing for an audience whose opinions would determine not just her immediate future but her reputation in a community where success or failure would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Victoria's pride was evident in her beaming smile and enthusiastic commentary about Elena's achievements. Her earlier reservations about hiring an inexperienced outsider replaced by genuine admiration for results that had exceeded everyone's most optimistic projections. Her support provided emotional anchor during moments when the pressure of performance threatened to overwhelm Elena's confidence, reminding her that she'd already proven herself to people whose opinions mattered most. Jake's reaction to Elena's success with Midnight went beyond professional satisfaction to encompass personal emotions that had been building throughout their weeks of working together toward this crucial moment. His expression mixed gratitude and admiration with something deeper and more complex, suggesting feelings that had developed beyond simple appreciation for her professional capabilities to encompass genuine affection for the woman whose courage and determination had saved his ranch from financial disaster. The negotiation session that followed the demonstration was conducted with businesslike efficiency that barely concealed the underlying tension about terms and conditions that would determine whether Elena's success translated into the financial salvation that Willowbrook Ranch desperately needed. Hammond's recommendation for purchase was enthusiastic but came with stipulations about price and payment schedules that would test Jake's willingness to accept terms that might be less favorable than his initial hopes had suggested. Blackwood's offer for Midnight was generous enough to resolve the ranch's immediate financial problems while providing capital for expansion and improvement that could transform Willowbrook from struggling family operation to thriving business enterprise. The terms included provisions for Elena to provide consulting services for other difficult animals in Blackwood's collection, offering opportunities for professional development that could establish her reputation beyond the confines of this single success story. Elena's response to the business discussions revealed her growing understanding of her value in markets she'd never imagined entering, as Hammond and Blackwood competed for access to training methods that could revolutionize their approaches to working with problematic animals. Her techniques had commercial potential that extended far beyond Midnight's individual case, suggesting possibilities for career development that could provide long-term security for both her and Tommy. The celebration that evening was everything Elena had dreamed of during the difficult weeks of preparation, with the entire ranch community gathering to acknowledge her achievement and toast the success that had exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The financial security provided by Midnight's sale would allow Jake to pay off inherited debts while investing in improvements that could attract additional clients seeking specialized training services that Elena had proven capable of providing. Jake's private conversation with Elena after the other guests had departed was both professional and intensely personal, acknowledging the debt he owed her while expressing feelings that had developed beyond simple gratitude to encompass genuine love for the woman whose arrival had transformed not just his business prospects but his understanding of what partnership could accomplish when based on mutual respect and shared commitment to common goals. Elena's response to Jake's declaration was complicated by awareness that her success with Midnight had changed her circumstances in ways that opened new possibilities while creating new responsibilities that she was only beginning to understand. Her feelings for Jake were genuine and deep, but she recognized that their relationship would need to navigate challenges beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together, including community expectations and family dynamics that would influence their future happiness. The wedding that took place 3 months later was attended by neighbors who had witnessed Elena's transformation from desperate outsider to respected community member whose expertise had established Willowbrook Ranch as the territorial destination for specialized horse training services. Her success with Midnight had created opportunities for working with other difficult animals, building a client base that valued understanding over force and partnership over domination in their relationships with valuable livestock. Tommy's adaptation to his new life exceeded even Elena's hopes for his happiness, as he thrived in an environment that encouraged his natural curiosity while providing the stability and security that had been missing during the difficult period following his father's death. His relationship with Jake developed into genuine affection that suggested possibilities for family relationships that neither Elena nor her son had dared hope for during their darkest moments. The training program that Elena developed at Willowbrook Ranch attracted clients from across the territory and beyond, establishing her reputation as an expert in rehabilitating animals whose behavioral problems had defeated conventional approaches. Her methods, based on understanding trauma and building trust rather than imposing dominance through force, revolutionized local attitudes toward working with difficult horses while providing financial success that ensured the ranch's continued prosperity. Midnight's recovery became legendary throughout the region, inspiring stories about the power of patience and understanding to heal wounds that seemed beyond repair. The stallion's offspring inherited both his magnificent conformation and his gentle temperament, creating a bloodline that was sought after by buyers who valued intelligence and trainability over simple power and speed. Elena's work with him had proven that healing was possible even in cases that experts had written off as hopeless. The success of Elena's unconventional training methods led to invitations to work with difficult animals at other ranches, establishing a traveling consultation business that provided additional income while spreading techniques that emphasized understanding over force throughout the broader ranching community. Her reputation grew beyond Wyoming's borders, attracting clients who traveled considerable distances to benefit from approaches that had proven effective where traditional methods had failed. Frank Calloway's attempts to undermine Elena's success eventually backfired as community members recognized his motives as territorial rather than genuine concern for public welfare, leading to social isolation that forced him to abandon his schemes for acquiring Willowbrook Ranch assets. His continued hostility became increasingly irrelevant as Elena's achievements established her as a valued community member whose contributions were recognized and appreciated by neighbors who had initially viewed her with suspicion. Years later, visitors to Willowbrook Ranch would find a thriving operation that served as a model for humane animal training methods where Elena's techniques had become standard practice and her philosophy of partnership over dominance had influenced an entire generation of young trainers. The ranch's success story became an inspiration for other struggling operations, proving that innovation and determination could overcome even the most challenging circumstances when guided by wisdom and supported by community cooperation. Elena's journey from desperate widow to respected expert in animal rehabilitation demonstrated the power of unexpected opportunities to transform lives in ways that seemed impossible when viewed from the depths of crisis and desperation. Her success with Midnight had opened doors to a future that exceeded her wildest dreams, providing not just financial security but professional fulfillment and personal happiness that made the risks she'd taken seem like investments in a destiny that had been waiting for her courage to claim it. The legacy of Elena's work extended far beyond the immediate success of her partnership with Jake and the financial salvation of Willowbrook Ranch, influencing training methods and animal welfare practices throughout the region while inspiring other women to pursue careers in fields traditionally dominated by men. Her story became a testament to the value of unconventional wisdom and the importance of seeing potential where others saw only problems, proving that the most remarkable transformations often begin with someone brave enough to believe that healing is possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. 6 months later, Elena stood watching Midnight graze peacefully in the same paddock where their impossible journey began. The stallion who once raged with trauma now approached her with gentle trust. Jake carried news of 3 more ranchers seeking her unique rehabilitation methods. Tommy raced across the yard, transformed from a fearful child into a confident boy who'd found his home. Victoria brought the letter from Hammond and Associates, offering consultation contracts across the territory. Elena's reputation had spread, turning her from desperate widow into respected pioneer of humane horse training. Her methods were revolutionizing the industry. As wedding plans progressed and students arrived to learn her techniques, Elena marveled at how one act of courage had transformed everything. Sometimes impossible dreams only required believing they might be possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.